Hello and welcome to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar. In this video we'll be sharing some quick fire quotes on Henry Clerval. So, Victor's closest friend, a loyal and supportive figure, Henry Clerval is depicted as a generally nice guy. Like Victor, Clerval is presented as ambitious, adventurous and full of an enthusiasm for life. Clerval's father wants him to study commerce and business, but he persuades his father to let him read science. That puts him in the same course as Victor. Even Clerval is not informed of Victor's creation, the monster. This adds to the isolation of our protagonist, Victor Frankenstein, and the experiences of suffering in silence that we witness. There tends to be a growing contrast across this novel, in Henry's life anyway, of Victor becoming more depressed and Henry becoming more excited about life. Clerval is shown to be full of enthusiasm, which contrasts to Victor's gloom. They actually both go travelling together and they journey to Britain together. Unfortunately though, Clerval is killed in Volume 3 by the monster. This further isolates Victor, who is accused of Clerval's murder. We have to consider, as we examine these quotes, what kind of symbol is Henry Clerval across Shelley's novel? Perfectly humane, so thoughtful in his generosity, so full of kindness and tenderness amidst his passion. Why not hit pause and consider the answers to these 4 questions? So Frankenstein says this, describing his friend Clerval. He says this at the start in chapter 2 of the novel, and it's the use of abstract nouns. It's the fact that we're listing such virtuous qualities, and also the fact that these are qualities that more that we read the novel, the less we see in Victor. So we're thinking of words like generosity, kindness, tenderness. He's thoughtful, humane. He's full of passion. If anything, Clerval sounds a bit too perfect. We have to question why Shelley does this. Perhaps it is simply to contrast the positive characteristics that Clerval has against Victor Frankenstein's flaws and faults, especially as they will unfold in this novel. Now look at this quote and examine the questions. And hit pause if you need thinking time. Study had before secluded me from my fellow creatures and rendered me unsocial, but Clerval called forth the better feelings of my heart. So once more we have Frankenstein talking about his friend Clerval. This is found from chapter 6. And this is the time in the novel where Frankenstein is withdrawn because his seclusion is his time to create the monster. It's interesting to note that he refers to his fellow students as fellow creatures, but it's important to note that the feelings Clerval produces as better feelings of Victor's heart suggests to the reader the power that Clerval has over Frankenstein, as he can actually distract Victor from science. It's interesting to think of the isolation that Victor associates with his work. He also calls it the study had before secluded me. But it's Clerval who liberates him and called forth the better feelings of my heart. I wonder if Shelley is trying to show us that even Frankenstein understands that there are feelings which are better and more important than his love and passion for science. It also highlights the strength of Clerval's influence over Frankenstein, that even in the height of his mania and fascination with science, Victor realises he must look out for his friend and be seen to support being sociable with feelings of his heart for Clerval. Now obviously there's nothing romantic implied here, but what we're considering is that Clerval brings out the best in Victor and calls him away from his passions. Tears also gushed from the eyes of Clerval as he read the account of my misfortune. Hit pause and consider the questions below. So how did you get on? Well, we're learning once more of Frankenstein's views of a situation, an emotional moment for him. And it's in chapter 7. The verb gushed shows the intensity of emotion that Clerval feels when he hears of Frankenstein's woes and misfortunes. This shows the reader how close they are, though it's interesting to note that Clerval is never directly informed of the creation of the monster, the thing that triggers Victor to be so unhappy. Yet without knowing the details, Clerval is still deeply compassionate and worried for his friend. So why does Shelley include this? Perhaps she's suggesting that Frankenstein must have had some attributes that are positive, so that people like Clerval can feel strongly towards him and actually care. Or it could be that she's trying to suggest that Frankenstein is not deserving of such friends who care so deeply for him, considering the terrible things he does and the lack of compassion he shows to the monster. Regardless, this is quite an important quotation. It's the also in the whole sentence that illustrates exactly how much Clerval cares for Victor. Alas, how great the contrast between us. Hit pause and consider the 4 questions below. Alas, how great the contrast between us signals Frankenstein's disappointment through the interjection alas when describing Clerval. But he's really describing his disappointment at himself, that he is so different from Clerval. And he says this in chapter 18. By this point, the monster has murdered many. By describing the differences between himself and Clerval using the adjective great, Victor is once more reaffirming for us what we already had suspicions of earlier, that they are different. The contrast here is that Clerval is innocent and will die an innocent death. Yet Victor will be accused of murder, and although not indeed, in part is responsible for the actions of his creation, whom he willfully rejected. And it's the burden of knowing that he's responsible that ruins his sense of identity and worth as the novel progresses. Shelley shows the reader that whilst Clerval is pure, honest and perfect, Frankenstein is becoming all the more clear to us as the opposite. Furthermore, perhaps Shelley wants us to know that Frankenstein is also aware of his flaws, something that maybe we overlook as we see the mad creator seem almost too self-obsessed to notice his failings. Here is a moment where he acknowledges that he is not perfect. I would not quit Henry for a moment, but followed him as his shadow to protect him from the fancied rage of his destroyer. Hit pause in order to answer the questions. So within this quote, Frankenstein is once more talking about Clerval, and it happens just 2 chapters in chapter 19 before Clerval is found dead, strangled with nothing but black marks. It's evidence that the monster's done it, obviously, but in this quotation, he seems adamant, I would not quit Henry for a moment, but followed him as his shadow. The simile, as his shadow, shows the reader how close Frankenstein is to Clerval and how deeply he doesn't want to be left away from him for fear of what may happen to him. It's the contrast as well between what's protection against destruction, the fancied rage of his destroyer. At this stage, it's evident that Victor is aware of the threat of the monster. He understood the threats that were made. Shelley shows us Frankenstein is capable of showing feelings towards his family and friends. It definitely foreshadows Henry's eventual death at the hands of the monster. But it also shows the inability of Victor to understand the limits of what he can do to save his friend from the monster. So is Henry just a symbol of purity? That's for you to decide. Why not subscribe to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar for all things English, literary and grammatical?